You'll never be a real nurse, Catherine. You're just playing dress-up in scrubs." Those words hit me like a scalpel to the chest, delivered with surgical precision by my own sister at our family's 4th of July barbecue. Miranda stood there in her pristine white coat, fresh from her cardiothoracic surgery residency at Johns Hopkins, looking down at me like I was something she'd scrape off her designer heels. The entire backyard went silent. Uncle Robert stopped flipping burgers. Aunt Linda's potato salad spoon froze mid-stir. Even the kids in the pool seemed to sense the tension crackling through the humid Baltimore air. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from. And if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. But here's what Miranda didn't know that day, what nobody at that barbecue could have possibly imagined. In less than 6 months, I would be the one standing over Governor Patricia Kellerman's chest cavity, my hands steady as steel, performing emergency surgery while the most prestigious doctors in Maryland stood helplessly by. I would be the one to crack open her sternum when her heart stopped beating. I would be the one to massage life back into the most powerful woman in our state, while my sister watched from the gallery, her mouth hanging open in disbelief. My name is Catherine Mitchell, and I'm a trauma nurse at Baltimore General Hospital. Not the glamorous kind of nurse you see in movies, all perfect hair and romantic storylines. I'm the kind who gets elbow-deep in blood at 3 in the morning, who holds pressure on wounds that would make most people faint, who talks gang members down from violence while stitching up their enemies in the bed next to them. I'm the kind of nurse who sees things that would break most people, and I do it all while my own family questions whether what I do even matters. Miranda had always been the golden child. Valedictorian at Northwestern, medical degree from Harvard, surgical residency at the most prestigious hospital on the East Coast. She collected achievements like some people collect stamps, each one carefully displayed and polished until it gleamed. Our parents had a whole wall in their Potomac home dedicated to her accomplishments. Diplomas, awards, newspaper clippings about the youngest surgeon to perform a triple bypass at Hopkins. The wall was practically a shrine to Miranda Mitchell, MD. My corner of that same wall? A single photo of me graduating from Montgomery Community College with my RN degree, not even centered, just tucked into the corner like an afterthought, like maybe they hoped no one would notice the difference between Harvard Medical and a community college nursing program. The thing is, I never intended to become a nurse. When I was 18, I wanted to be a doctor too. I had the grades, the MCAT scores, the recommendation letters. I'd been accepted to George Washington University's pre-med program, but then Dad had his first heart attack, and Mom's hours got cut at the department store, and suddenly someone needed to work to keep food on the table while Miranda was busy being brilliant at Harvard on a full scholarship. So I took a job as a medical assistant at a family practice, thinking I'd save money for a year and then start college. 1 year became 2, 2 became 3. When Dad had his second heart attack, I was the one sitting in the ICU night after night, watching the nurses work, really watching them. I saw how they anticipated what the doctors needed before the doctors even knew they needed it. I watched them comfort families in ways that no medical textbook could teach. I saw them make split-second decisions that meant the difference between life and death. That's when I realized something that would take Miranda years to understand. Healing isn't just about the person holding the scalpel. It's about the person who knows which scalpel to hand them, who monitors every heartbeat while they work, who notices the subtle changes that mean everything is about to go wrong. But try explaining that to a family that measures success in degrees and prestige. When I announced I was going to nursing school, you would have thought I'd told them I was dropping out to join the circus. Mom cried. Dad just stared at me like I'd lost my mind. And Miranda laughed. Actually laughed like it was the funniest joke she'd ever heard. "Nursing," she said, barely able to get the word out between giggles. "Catherine, you do realize that nurses work for doctors, right? You'll basically be a waitress with medical training." Even then, 5 years ago, her words stung. But I pushed through nursing school anyway. I graduated with honors, passed my NCLEX on the first try, and got hired immediately into the trauma unit at Baltimore General. Not because I was settling for less than being a doctor, but because I was choosing to be exactly what I was meant to be. The trauma unit at Baltimore General is not for the faint of heart. We get everything: car accidents, gunshot wounds, overdoses, industrial accidents, domestic violence cases that would make your stomach turn. We're the first stop for the worst day of someone's life, and we have to be ready for anything. In trauma, there's no time for ego, no time for hierarchy. When someone comes through those doors dying, everyone works together, or everyone fails together. I found my rhythm in that chaos. While other nurses complained about the stress, the hours, the emotional toll, I thrived. I learned to read the monitors like sheet music, to anticipate complications before they happened, to stay calm when everyone else was falling apart. Dr. Sarah Chen, our trauma chief, started trusting me with more responsibility. When the residents were too nervous to intubate, she'd let me do it. When we needed someone to assist in emergency surgery, she'd call my name. Miranda, meanwhile, was excelling in her own world. Cardiothoracic surgery was her specialty, and she was brilliant at it. I'll give her that. She could repair hearts with the precision of a Swiss watchmaker, could perform procedures that other surgeons wouldn't even attempt, but cardio was planned surgery, scheduled surgery. Her patients were prepped and draped and anesthetized in sterile operating rooms with perfect lighting and all the time in the world to think through every move. My patients came to me broken and bleeding, often unconscious, sometimes with no identification and no family. I had to make life or death decisions with incomplete information in imperfect conditions. But Miranda couldn't see the skill in that. To her, if it wasn't happening in an OR with a surgeon in charge, it wasn't real medicine. The tension between us had been building for years, but it all came to a head that July 4th. The whole family was there. Our parents, aunts, uncles, cousins, even our grandmother who rarely left her assisted living facility. It should have been a celebration, a chance for the Mitchell family to come together and enjoy each other's company. Instead, it became the stage for Miranda to publicly humiliate me in front of everyone I loved. It started innocuously enough. Cousin Tommy was asking me about work, genuinely interested in what I did. I was telling him about a save we'd made the week before. A construction worker who'd fallen 3 stories and come in with internal bleeding and a collapsed lung. We'd gotten him stabilized and into surgery within minutes of arrival, and he'd gone home to his family 2 weeks later. "That's incredible, Catherine," Tommy said. "You basically saved his life." That's when Miranda appeared beside us, fresh drink in hand, that condescending smile already forming on her lips. "Well, let's be accurate here," she interrupted. "Catherine helped save his life. The surgeon saved his life. Catherine just assisted." The dismissal in her voice was unmistakable, not just of me, but of everything I did, everything I'd worked for. 5 years of swallowing her comments, 5 years of being made to feel small, 5 years of watching her treat my career like a cute hobby I'd eventually outgrow. "Actually," I said, my voice steady despite the anger building in my chest, "I was the one who caught the internal bleeding. I was the one who noticed his blood pressure dropping before anyone else. I was the one who got him typed and crossed for blood while the surgeon was still being called in." Miranda's smile didn't waver. If anything, it got wider, more patronizing. "That's what nurses do, Catherine. You follow protocols, you do what you're trained to do. But you don't make the real decisions, you don't actually save lives." The conversation around us had stopped. Family members were pretending not to listen, but I could see them leaning in, waiting to see what would happen next. This wasn't just about medicine anymore. This was about years of being told I wasn't good enough, smart enough, important enough. "You know what, Miranda?" I said, setting down my beer and turning to face her fully. "You're right. I'm not a surgeon. I'm not going to cure cancer or perform groundbreaking procedures, but what I do matters just as much as what you do." She actually laughed, out loud, in front of everyone. "Catherine, please, don't be ridiculous. What you do is important, sure, but let's not pretend it's the same thing as being a real doctor. You take vital signs and pass medications. I hold human hearts in my hands." That's when she said it, the words that would echo in my head for months to come. "You'll never be a real nurse, Catherine. You're just playing dress-up in scrubs." The silence that followed was deafening. Even the kids in the pool had stopped splashing. Uncle Robert's burger was burning on the grill, but he didn't move to flip it. Everyone was staring at us, waiting to see if I would crumble under the weight of my sister's cruelty. Instead, I smiled, a real smile, not the fake one Miranda had perfected for hospital politics. "You know what the difference is between us, Miranda?" I said, my voice carrying across the suddenly quiet backyard. "You see patients as problems to solve. I see them as people to save. And when the day comes that you need someone who knows the difference, you'll understand exactly how real a nurse I am." I grabbed my purse and walked toward the gate, leaving behind the barbecue, the family, and my sister's poisonous words. But I didn't leave behind my dignity. For the first time in years, I felt proud of who I was and what I did. I had no idea that in less than 6 months, those words would prove to be prophetic in ways I never could have imagined. 3 months after the barbecue incident, Miranda got exactly what she'd always wanted: a fellowship position at the prestigious Cardiovascular Institute of Maryland, working directly under Dr. Alexander Whitmore, the man who literally wrote the textbook on heart surgery. It was the kind of opportunity that only came along once in a lifetime, the kind that would cement her reputation as one of the country's rising surgical stars. The announcement came at Sunday dinner, of course. Mom had made her famous pot roast, and the whole family was gathered around the mahogany table in the formal dining room. Miranda waited until dessert was served before dropping her news, timing it perfectly for maximum impact. "I have some exciting news to share," she said, dabbing her lips with the linen napkin like she was about to accept an Oscar. "Dr. Whitmore has personally selected me for his Advanced Cardiac Surgery Fellowship. Out of 300 applicants nationwide, he chose me. A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel." Now back to where we left off. The table erupted in congratulations. Dad beamed with pride, Mom started crying happy tears, and even Grandma Rose clapped her arthritic hands together. They peppered Miranda with questions about the fellowship, the salary, the prestige, the future opportunities it would create. I sat there quietly, cutting my apple pie into smaller and smaller pieces, watching my family celebrate my sister's achievement while she basked in their adoration. Don't get me wrong, I was proud of her too. The fellowship was genuinely impressive, and Miranda had worked hard for it. But watching the way she soaked up every compliment, every expression of amazement, reminded me exactly why our relationship had become so strained. "Catherine," Dad finally said, turning to me with an almost guilty expression, "how are things going at the hospital for you?" Before I could answer, Miranda jumped in. "Oh, Catherine's doing great. She got promoted to senior trauma nurse last month, didn't you, Kat?" The way she said it, with that subtle condescension, made it sound like I'd been promoted to senior grocery bagger. She wasn't wrong, I had gotten the promotion. But she somehow managed to make it sound insignificant compared to her fellowship news. "Actually," I said, setting down my fork, "I also got accepted into the Advanced Practice Nurse program at University of Maryland. I'll be specializing in emergency and trauma care." This was true. After years of watching doctors make decisions I knew I could make better, I'd finally decided to take the next step. The program would allow me to diagnose patients, order tests, even perform certain procedures independently. It was a big deal in the nursing world, even if my family didn't understand that. "That's wonderful, honey," Mom said, but I could see her eyes already drifting back to Miranda, waiting for her to say something that would inevitably overshadow my news. Miranda didn't disappoint. "You know, Kat, if you'd really wanted to be a doctor, you could have just gone to medical school. This nurse practitioner thing seems like, well, like you're trying to be something you're not." There it was again, that subtle knife twist that Miranda had perfected over the years. She never outright insulted me. That would be too obvious. Instead, she planted little seeds of doubt, made me question my own choices, my own worth. "I'm not trying to be anything," I replied evenly. "I'm becoming exactly what I want to be. Someone who can provide comprehensive care to patients in critical situations." Miranda smiled, that patronizing smile I'd grown to hate. "Of course. I just think it's interesting that you keep moving toward more doctor-like responsibilities instead of embracing what makes nursing special." The implication was clear. I was ashamed of being a nurse, trying to climb some imaginary ladder to become more like her. It wasn't true, but the way she said it made me doubt myself for just a moment. Maybe I was overreaching. Maybe I should be content with where I was. That doubt lasted exactly until my next shift at Baltimore General. It was a Tuesday night in October, the kind of crisp autumn evening when the emergency department usually saw a mix of cardiac events from the sudden temperature change and trauma cases from people driving too fast on wet leaves. I was working with Dr. Martinez, one of our newer residents who was still learning to trust his instincts in the chaos of trauma care. Around 11:30, the ambulance bay doors burst open and the paramedics wheeled in a 50-something man in full cardiac arrest. A construction worker, according to the EMTs, had collapsed at a job site with chest pain and stopped breathing in the ambulance. "No pulse for 6 minutes," the lead paramedic called out as we transferred him to our trauma bay. "We've been doing CPR and bagging him the whole way." Dr. Martinez looked at the monitors, then at me, then back at the monitors. I could see the panic starting to creep into his eyes. This was his third month in trauma, and he'd never handled a cardiac arrest this severe. "What do you want to do, doctor?" I asked, already pulling the crash cart closer and checking our intubation supplies. We should. He was freezing up, and I could see it happening. The patient's condition was deteriorating by the second, and we needed action, not hesitation. "Let's get him intubated first," I suggested, drawing up the medications he'd need. "I'll prep the laryngoscope." Dr. Martinez nodded gratefully and moved to the head of the bed, but when he tried to intubate, his hands were shaking so badly he couldn't get the tube placed. 2 attempts, both failures, and the patient's oxygen levels were dropping dangerously low. "Step back," I said quietly, moving beside him. "Let me try." In nursing school, they don't officially teach you to intubate. That's supposed to be a doctor's job. But in trauma, when someone's dying and the doctor can't get it done, you do whatever it takes to save the patient. I'd intubated dozens of patients over the years, always under a doctor's supervision, always with their permission. This time, there wasn't time to ask permission. I slid the laryngoscope blade into the patient's mouth, visualized his vocal cords, and smoothly inserted the endotracheal tube. Perfect placement on the first try. Dr. Martinez stood there staring at me like I'd just performed magic. "How did you?" he started to ask. "Experience," I said, connecting the bag to the tube and starting to ventilate the patient. "Now let's get some epinephrine and see if we can get him back." We worked for another 20 minutes, cycling through medications and compressions, shocking his heart twice with the defibrillator. Just when I was starting to think we might lose him, the monitor showed a rhythm, then a pulse, then blood pressure. The patient's eyes fluttered open 40 minutes later. He was groggy and confused, but he was alive. He'd go on to make a full recovery and return to work within 6 weeks. Dr. Martinez pulled me aside afterward, still shaken from the experience. "Catherine, I need to thank you," he said. "If you hadn't stepped in when you did, if you hadn't gotten that tube placed, we're a team," I told him. "That's what teams do." But as I drove home that night, I couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. Not just the save. We made saves all the time in trauma. It was the moment when I'd stepped into a role that officially belonged to someone else, made a decision that could have ended my career if it had gone wrong, all because I knew I could do it better than the person who was supposed to be in charge. That's when I started to understand something that Miranda, for all her surgical skill, might never grasp. Real medicine isn't about titles or hierarchy or who went to the most prestigious school. It's about competence and judgment, and the courage to act when action is needed. The differences between Miranda and me became even more apparent a few weeks later when she started her fellowship. She'd call Mom every few days with updates about the important surgeries she was observing, the renowned doctors she was working with, the research projects she was contributing to. Everything was about prestige, about building her reputation, about positioning herself for the next big opportunity. Meanwhile, I was working 60-hour weeks in the trauma unit, dealing with overdoses and car accidents and domestic violence cases that would never make it into medical journals. My patients weren't famous, their surgeries weren't groundbreaking, but they were alive because of the work I did, and that felt more meaningful than any fellowship or publication. The tension between our two worlds came to a head again at Thanksgiving. Miranda had been working with Dr. Whitmore for 2 months by then, and she was full of stories about the complex cases they were handling, the innovative techniques they were developing, the conferences she was attending. "We had this amazing case last week," she told the assembled family over turkey and stuffing. "A 60-year-old man with a rare congenital heart defect that had never been successfully repaired. Dr. Whitmore let me assist in the surgery. It took 8 hours, but we completely reconstructed his heart valve using a technique that's only been attempted 3 times before." Everyone hung on her every word. The precision, the complexity, the groundbreaking nature of the work. It was exactly the kind of medicine that impressed people who didn't work in healthcare. "That's incredible, Miranda," Aunt Linda said. "You're literally saving lives with cutting-edge medicine." "It's what we do," Miranda replied with false modesty that fooled everyone except me. When the conversation finally turned to me, I found myself talking about a very different kind of case. A 19-year-old gang member who'd been shot 3 times and had come into our trauma bay more dead than alive. We'd worked on him for 2 hours, through multiple cardiac arrests, through massive blood loss, through complications that would have killed most people. But the part of the story that mattered most to me wasn't the medical heroics. It was what happened afterward. When his mother showed up at the hospital, she was a single mom who worked 2 jobs to keep her son out of trouble, and she'd failed. She sat in our family conference room sobbing, convinced that she'd lost her boy and that it was her fault. I'd spent my break sitting with her, not saying much, just being present while she processed the worst night of her life. When her son stabilized enough to move to the ICU, I was the one who walked her upstairs, who introduced her to the nurses who would be taking care of him, who made sure she knew how to navigate the hospital system. 3 months later, that kid sent me a handwritten letter from the community college where he was studying automotive repair. He was alive, he was out of the gang, and he was building a life that would make his mother proud. "That's a nice story, Catherine," Miranda said when I finished. "But don't you think your time might be better spent focusing on the medical aspects of patient care rather than the social work?" There it was again, the subtle dismissal, the implication that caring about patients as people rather than just medical problems was somehow unprofessional or misguided. "I think," I said carefully, "that healing involves more than just fixing what's broken. Sometimes it means helping people find reasons to stay fixed." Miranda laughed, not unkindly but with that tone that suggested I was being naive. "Catherine, you can't save everyone, and you definitely can't save them from themselves. Your job is to provide medical care, not to be their therapist or their social worker or their life coach." "Maybe that's the difference between us," I replied. "You see patients as cases to solve. I see them as people to heal. And maybe," Miranda said, her voice taking on an edge, "that's why I'm performing groundbreaking surgery with the country's leading cardiac surgeon, and you're still trying to figure out what you want to be when you grow up." The table went quiet. Even Dad, who usually tried to smooth over our arguments, just stared down at his mashed potatoes. Miranda had crossed a line, and everyone knew it. I could have escalated. I could have pointed out that her groundbreaking surgery was still just following someone else's lead, that for all her technical skill she'd never had to make a life-or-death decision without a supervisor looking over her shoulder. I could have mentioned that her prestigious fellowship was in a controlled environment where every variable was planned and predictable, while I dealt with chaos and uncertainty every single day. Instead, I just smiled and changed the subject, because I was learning something that Miranda hadn't figured out yet. The people who constantly need to prove their importance usually aren't as important as they think they are. But as I drove home that night, I found myself wondering if she might be right. Was I trying to be something I wasn't? Was I overreaching, trying to compete with her in a game where the rules were stacked against me? Those doubts would haunt me for the next few months, right up until the night when everything changed. The night when Governor Kellerman's motorcade would screech into our ambulance bay, and I would discover exactly what kind of nurse I really was. February 18th started like any other Wednesday night shift at Baltimore General. The emergency department had its usual winter mix of patients, a few slip-and-fall injuries from the ice storm that had hit the city, some respiratory cases from the elderly, and a handful of cardiac events triggered by people shoveling snow who probably shouldn't have been. Nothing out of the ordinary for a Level 1 trauma center in the middle of winter. I was working triage with Dr. Patel, one of our most experienced emergency physicians, when the first call came in around 11:47 p.m. The communication was garbled at first. Something about a high-priority motorcade en route, possible cardiac event, ETA 12 minutes. Then the line went dead. "That's weird," Dr. Patel muttered, trying to call back dispatch. "Catherine, did you catch what they said about a motorcade?" Before I could answer, my phone buzzed with a text from my charge nurse. "Clear Trauma Bay 1 immediately. VIP incoming. Emergency protocols in effect." That's when we knew this wasn't routine. VIP protocols at Baltimore General meant one of 3 things: a visiting dignitary, a major political figure, or a high-profile celebrity. Given the motorcade reference and the late hour, my money was on politics. I started clearing Trauma Bay 1, making sure we had full supplies, checking the monitors, preparing for whatever was coming through our doors. The other nurses were buzzing with speculation. Was it the mayor, a senator, someone from the governor's staff? Dr. Chen appeared at my elbow, looking unusually tense. "Catherine, I need you on point for this one. Whatever comes through those doors, you're my lead nurse." That was significant. Dr. Chen didn't hand out lead assignments lightly, especially for VIP cases where every decision would be scrutinized. The fact that she was trusting me with this meant more than she probably realized. At exactly 11:59 p.m., the ambulance bay doors exploded open and chaos poured in. Not one ambulance, but 3, followed immediately by a convoy of black SUVs with government plates. State police officers flooded into the department, followed by what had to be Secret Service agents in dark suits with earpieces. And then they wheeled her in. Governor Patricia Kellerman, the most powerful woman in Maryland, unconscious on a stretcher with paramedics performing CPR. Even in crisis, she looked formidable. Silver hair perfectly styled despite the medical equipment, designer suit jacket cut away to reveal monitoring electrodes, face pale but still carrying the authority that had made her a political force for 2 decades. A 63-year-old female collapsed during a fundraising dinner at the Harbor Hotel. The lead paramedic called out as we transferred her to our trauma bed. Witnesses say she complained of chest pain and shortness of breath, then lost consciousness. She's been in cardiac arrest for 8 minutes. We've given 2 rounds of epi, shocked her twice, and got her intubated in the field. Dr. Chen immediately took charge, running through the protocols while I connected monitors and established additional IV access. Governor Kellerman's heart rhythm was erratic, her blood pressure barely detectable, her oxygen levels dangerously low despite mechanical ventilation. "Catherine, get me a bedside echo," Dr. Chen ordered, "and call cardiology. We need someone down here now." I was already pulling the ultrasound machine over when one of the Secret Service agents stepped forward. "Doctor, we need to know her status immediately. There are security implications." Dr. Chen barely glanced at him. "Her status is critical. She's in cardiogenic shock, and if we don't stabilize her in the next few minutes, those security implications won't matter." While we worked, I noticed a familiar figure pushing through the crowd of government officials and security personnel. Miranda, still in her surgical scrubs, looking around the trauma bay with the expression of someone who belonged there more than anyone else. She'd obviously been called in as part of the cardiology consult, which made sense given her fellowship with Dr. Whitmore. What didn't make sense was why she was inserting herself into our resuscitation when we hadn't even gotten the patient stabilized yet. "Excuse me," she said, approaching Dr. Chen with that confident tone I knew so well. "I'm Dr. Miranda Mitchell, from the Cardiovascular Institute. Dr. Whitmore is en route, but I'm here to assess potential surgical intervention." Chen nodded briefly but didn't stop working. "We're still in initial resuscitation. No surgical decisions until we get her stable." Miranda moved closer to the bed, studying the monitors with the air of someone making important observations. "What's her troponin level? Has anyone ordered a CT angiogram? We should be thinking about emergency catheterization." "Doctor," I said quietly, "we're still working on getting a sustainable blood pressure. Cardiac enzymes are drawn but not back yet." Miranda looked at me with surprise, as if she'd just noticed I was there. "Catherine, what are you doing here?" The question hung in the air for a moment. What was I doing here? I was the lead trauma nurse on the most important case our hospital had seen in years. I was the one Dr. Chen had specifically chosen to manage the care of the governor of Maryland. But somehow, Miranda's presence made me question my own role. "I'm the primary nurse on this case," I replied, returning my attention to the governor's IV lines. "Oh," Miranda said, and I could hear the subtle dismissal in that single syllable. "Well, once we get her upstairs for surgery, the cardiac team will take over anyway." That's when Dr. Chen looked up from the ultrasound she was performing. "We're not going anywhere yet. She's got significant cardiac tamponade. There's fluid around her heart that's preventing it from pumping effectively. We need to drain it here, now." Miranda stepped closer, peering at the ultrasound screen. "Shouldn't we wait for Dr. Whitmore? This is a complex procedure that really requires—" "Dr. Mitchell," Dr. Chen interrupted with respect, "we don't have time to wait for anyone. The governor's blood pressure is dropping, and she's going to die if we don't act immediately." That's when I saw something I'd never seen before. Miranda looked uncertain. For all her surgical training, all her technical expertise, she'd never been in a situation where every second counted, and there was no time for consultation or second opinions. Dr. Chen was already prepping for a pericardiocentesis, a procedure where you insert a needle directly into the sac around the heart to drain the fluid that's compressing it. It's high risk, high skill, and in emergency situations, it can be the difference between life and death. "Catherine, I need you to prep her chest and get me a pericardiocentesis kit," Dr. Chen said, "and someone get me ultrasound guidance." I moved immediately, cleaning the governor's chest with betadine and draping the area while Dr. Chen prepared the needle. This was the kind of procedure that Miranda would normally observe from the gallery in a sterile operating room performed by senior attendings with perfect lighting and ideal conditions. Instead, she was watching it happen in a chaotic trauma bay, performed by an emergency physician with a trauma nurse assisting, while politicians and security agents looked on from behind a hastily erected privacy screen. Dr. Mitchell, one of the Secret Service agents, said to Miranda, "Is this the right approach? Shouldn't the governor be in surgery?" Miranda hesitated, glancing between Dr. Chen and the monitors. "Well, normally we would prefer to handle this in a more controlled environment, but she'll be dead before we get her to an OR." Dr. Chen finished, positioning the needle under ultrasound guidance. "Catherine, hold pressure here while I advance." I placed my hands exactly where Dr. Chen indicated, providing counter pressure while she carefully inserted the needle between the governor's ribs and into the pericardial space. One wrong move could puncture the heart itself, too shallow, and we wouldn't reach the fluid. The margin for error was essentially zero. "Got it," Dr. Chen said as dark fluid began flowing through the needle into the collection syringe. Immediately, the governor's blood pressure started to improve and her heart rhythm became more stable. "Excellent work," came a voice from behind us. Dr. Alexander Whitmore had arrived, still in his dinner jacket from whatever evening event he'd been attending. He studied the monitors approvingly. "Perfect needle placement, and her hemodynamics are responding beautifully." Miranda stepped forward quickly. "Dr. Whitmore, I was just explaining to the team that we should consider emergency surgery for definitive repair." Dr. Whitmore looked at her with slight confusion. "Surgery? For what?" "Dr. Chen just performed a textbook pericardiocentesis. The governor is stabilizing nicely." "But shouldn't we explore surgical options for the underlying cause?" Miranda pressed. "There could be ongoing bleeding, or Dr. Whitmore said gently, "Sometimes the best surgical decision is knowing when not to operate. The governor appears to have suffered a pericardial effusion, likely secondary to her cardiac event. The drainage procedure has resolved the immediate crisis. Surgery would be contraindicated unless her condition deteriorates." I watched Miranda's face carefully, seeing the moment when she realized she'd overstepped. In her eagerness to be involved in this high-profile case, she'd suggested unnecessary intervention on the governor of Maryland, in front of her fellowship director, in front of a room full of witnesses. Dr. Whitmore turned to Dr. Chen and me. "Outstanding work, both of you. This was exactly the right call at exactly the right time." Over the next hour, we continued stabilizing Governor Kellerman. Her cardiac enzymes came back showing a moderate heart attack, but nothing that required emergency surgery. The pericardial effusion had been the real threat, and the drainage procedure had saved her life. As we prepared to transfer her to the cardiac intensive care unit, Miranda approached me at the medication cart where I was preparing the governor's transfer medications. "Catherine," she said quietly, "I need to ask you something." I looked up from the medication labels I was checking. "What?" "That procedure Dr. Chen performed. Have you assisted with pericardiocentesis before?" "Several times," I replied. "It's not uncommon in trauma. We see it with chest injuries, sometimes with cardiac arrests." Miranda frowned. "But that's a very advanced procedure. In the cardiac surgery program, only senior residents are allowed to even observe." I could see where this was going. Miranda couldn't understand how a trauma nurse could be assisting with procedures that were considered advanced even in her prestigious surgical program. "Miranda," I said, setting down the medication syringe, "in trauma, we don't have the luxury of seniority levels and observation requirements. When someone is dying, you do whatever needs to be done to save them. But don't you think there should be oversight? Supervision? What if something had gone wrong?" I stared at her for a moment, realizing that she still didn't get it. Something was going wrong. The governor of Maryland was dying. Dr. Chen and I saved her life. "You assisted," Miranda corrected. "Dr. Chen saved her life." And there it was again. That needs to diminish my role, to reduce everything I did to following someone else's orders, even when I'd just helped save the life of the most important patient our hospital had ever treated. Miranda couldn't acknowledge that what I'd done required skill, judgment, and expertise. "You know what, Miranda?" I said, turning to face her fully. "You've been telling me for years that I'm not a real nurse, that I'm just playing dress-up, that I'll never be more than someone who follows orders. Catherine, I never said, you said exactly that, at the barbecue, in front of our entire family." My voice was getting louder, and I could see other staff members starting to glance our way. "But tonight, while you were suggesting unnecessary surgery on the governor of Maryland, I was helping perform the procedure that actually saved her life." Miranda's face flushed. "That's not fair. I was trying to provide comprehensive care options. You were trying to insert yourself into a case you didn't understand because it was high profile," I replied. "The difference is, I was here because Dr. Chen trusts my judgment and my skills. You were here because you thought it would look good on your fellowship evaluation. How dare you? How dare I, what? Tell the truth. I gestured toward the ICU where Governor Kellerman was now stable and surrounded by the best cardiac care team in the state. That woman is alive because a trauma team made the right decisions under pressure, not because a cardiac surgery fellow suggested procedures that weren't indicated. Miranda opened her mouth to respond, but Dr. Whitmore appeared beside us, looking tired but satisfied. Dr. Mitchell, he said to Miranda, I need to speak with you about tonight, in my office tomorrow morning. Miranda's face went pale. Of course, Dr. Whitmore. Is there a problem? We'll discuss it tomorrow, he said diplomatically, then turned to me. Nurse Mitchell, excellent work tonight. Dr. Chen tells me you're starting the advanced practice program next fall. If you ever consider a rotation through cardiac care, I'd be happy to discuss opportunities. The offer hung in the air between us. Dr. Whitmore, the man who had written the textbook on cardiac surgery, was suggesting that I might have a place in his program, the same program where Miranda was struggling to prove herself worthy of his attention. Thank you, Dr. Whitmore, I said. I'll definitely consider that. As he walked away, Miranda stared after him with a look I'd never seen before. Not anger, not frustration, but genuine fear. For the first time in her life, her position wasn't secure. Her competence was being questioned, and the sister she'd spent years diminishing had just been publicly praised by the most respected cardiac surgeon in the region. Catherine, she said quietly, you don't understand what just happened. I picked up the governor's transfer paperwork and looked at my sister. I understand perfectly. What just happened is that I saved someone's life, and for the first time, you saw me do it. I walked away, leaving Miranda standing alone by the medication cart, finally forced to confront the possibility that maybe, just maybe, she wasn't the only Mitchell sister who knew how to practice real medicine. The call came at 6:23 a.m., just as I was finishing my shift notes and preparing to head home. Governor Kellerman had been stable in the cardiac ICU for 6 hours, her condition steadily improving under the careful monitoring of the night team. I was exhausted but satisfied, riding the particular high that comes from saving a life that everyone will remember. Catherine, Dr. Chen's voice cut through the usual morning bustle of shift change. I need you in conference room 3, now. The tone in her voice made my stomach drop. Conference room 3 was where we held serious meetings, the kind where careers were discussed, where mistakes were dissected, where disciplinary actions were decided. Had something gone wrong with the governor? Had I made an error I wasn't aware of? I walked down the hall with mounting dread, my mind racing through every decision I'd made during the resuscitation. Had I missed something? Did something wrong? Overstepped my scope of practice in some way that was now coming back to haunt me? The conference room was packed. Dr. Chen sat at the head of the table, flanked by Dr. Whitmore and 2 people I didn't recognize, a stern-looking woman in a navy suit and a man with the bearing of someone accustomed to authority. State officials, I realized. They were here about the governor. Please, sit down, Catherine, Dr. Chen said, gesturing to an empty chair. My mouth went dry. Is Governor Kellerman okay? Did something happen? The governor is fine, the woman in the navy suit said. She's awake, alert, and asking to speak with the medical team that saved her life. I'm Deputy Chief of Staff Margaret Foster, and this is Director of Security James Walsh. We're here to discuss last night's events. Relief washed over me, followed immediately by confusion. I don't understand. Is there a problem? Dr. Whitmore leaned forward. Catherine, there's no problem, quite the opposite. But we need to discuss something that came to light during our investigation of the governor's medical emergency. Investigation? Director Walsh opened a tablet and turned it toward me. When a sitting governor suffers a cardiac event, we conduct a thorough review of everything that happened: medical records, security footage, timeline analysis. We need to ensure there was no foul play and that the response was appropriate. Of course, I said, though I still didn't understand why I was sitting in this room. Deputy Chief Foster spoke up. During our review, we discovered something unusual. The governor's medical records show that she was seen at Baltimore General 3 weeks ago for chest pain. Do you remember that visit? My mind raced back. 3 weeks ago, a busy Saturday evening shift. We'd had several cardiac cases that night, but I couldn't immediately recall. Then it hit me. The woman who'd come in around 9 p.m., complaining of chest pain and shortness of breath. Mid-60s, well-dressed, accompanied by what I'd assumed was private security. She'd given her name as Patricia Williams and paid cash for her visit. "I remember her," I said slowly, "but she said her name was Patricia Williams." "She was traveling incognito," Director Walsh explained. "The governor occasionally uses aliases when seeking medical care to avoid media attention. She came to Baltimore General specifically because of its reputation for discretion." Dr. Chen pulled out a file. "According to the records, you were her primary nurse during that visit. Can you tell us what happened?" I tried to piece together the details. She came in with chest pain, rating it about a 6 out of 10. Radiating to her left arm, associated with shortness of breath. She was very anxious, kept saying it was probably nothing, but her assistant had insisted she get checked out. "What was your assessment?" Dr. Whitmore asked. "Her EKG was normal, but something felt off. Her symptoms were classic for cardiac issues, but her presentation was, I don't know how to explain it. She seemed like she was downplaying her symptoms." Deputy Chief Foster nodded. "The governor has a tendency to minimize her health concerns. It's a common trait among high-level executives. What did you do?" "I advocated for additional testing. The attending physician, Dr. Harrison, wanted to discharge her with a diagnosis of anxiety, but I pushed for cardiac enzymes and a stress test." I remembered that night more clearly now. The woman who called herself Patricia Williams had been intelligent, articulate, and clearly accustomed to being in control. But there had been something in her eyes when she described her symptoms that made me think she was more worried than she was letting on. "Dr. Harrison wasn't happy about the additional tests," I continued. "He thought I was being overly cautious, but I'd seen too many women have their cardiac symptoms dismissed as anxiety." Dr. Whitmore was making notes. "And the results?" "The stress test showed some abnormalities. Not dramatic, but enough to warrant cardiology follow-up. I gave her information about lifestyle modifications and strongly recommended she see a cardiologist within the week." "Did she follow up?" "I assumed she'd gone to her regular physician." Deputy Chief Foster exchanged a look with Director Walsh. "She didn't. The governor's regular physician had no record of any cardiac concerns. She apparently decided the stress test results weren't significant enough to pursue." The room was quiet for a moment as the implications sank in. Dr. Chen broke the silence. "Catherine, the cardiologist who reviewed Governor Kellerman's case last night, believes that her cardiac event was the culmination of an ongoing process. If she'd had appropriate follow-up 3 weeks ago, this emergency might have been prevented. Or," Dr. Whitmore added, "if it couldn't have been prevented, early intervention might have made last night's resuscitation much more complicated. The governor is alive today partly because you recognized the warning signs weeks ago and documented them properly." I stared at them, trying to process what they were telling me. "I was just doing my job." "No," Deputy Chief Foster said firmly. "You were doing something much more important than that. You were advocating for a patient who couldn't advocate for herself. You pushed for testing that a physician wanted to skip. You provided care that directly contributed to saving the life of Maryland's governor." Director Walsh leaned forward. "There's more. During our review, we also looked at your personnel file and spoke with your colleagues. Dr. Chen, Dr. Martinez, several other physicians. They all told us the same thing. You consistently demonstrate clinical judgment that goes beyond your official role." Dr. Chen nodded. "Catherine, I've been watching your work for 3 years. You catch things other people miss. You anticipate problems before they develop. You make decisions that save lives. The question," Dr. Whitmore said, "is why you're not in a position where that level of clinical acumen is being fully utilized." I felt like the room was spinning. "I don't understand what you're asking." Deputy Chief Foster opened another file. "The state of Maryland is launching a new initiative to improve emergency cardiac care across the region. We need someone to lead the clinical protocols development, someone who understands both the medical complexities and the practical realities of emergency care. It's a hybrid position," Dr. Whitmore explained. "Part clinical practice, part administrative oversight, part education. You'd be working directly with hospitals across the state to standardize emergency cardiac protocols. The position," Director Walsh added, "comes with full prescriptive authority, clinical autonomy, and a salary that reflects the level of responsibility involved." I stared at them, hardly believing what I was hearing. "You're offering me a job? We're offering you the opportunity to do what you're already doing, but on a scale that could save hundreds of lives," Deputy Chief Foster said, "based on your clinical judgment, your advocacy skills, and your ability to perform under pressure." Chen smiled. Catherine, this is the kind of opportunity that comes along once in a career. You'd be reporting directly to the state health department, working with the best medical facilities in Maryland, shaping policy that will affect emergency care for years to come. But I'm just a nurse, I said, the words tumbling out before I could stop them. The room went completely silent. Dr. Whitmore was the first to speak. Catherine, you just helped save the life of the governor of Maryland. 3 weeks ago, you identified cardiac risk factors that a physician missed. Last night, you assisted with a life-saving procedure while demonstrating clinical judgment that impressed one of the state's leading cardiac surgeons. In what universe does any of that make you just a nurse? More importantly, Deputy Chief Foster added, you did all of that while thinking of yourself as just a nurse. Imagine what you could accomplish if you started thinking of yourself as the medical professional you actually are. Before I could respond, there was a knock on the conference room door. Dr. Chen called out, "Come in," and to my absolute shock, Miranda walked through the door. She looked like she hadn't slept. Her usually perfect hair was disheveled, her makeup smudged, and her surgical scrubs were wrinkled like she'd been sitting in a chair all night. "I'm sorry to interrupt," she said, her voice shaky. "Dr. Whitmore, you asked me to come by this morning to discuss." She stopped mid-sentence when she saw me sitting at the conference table surrounded by state officials and hospital administrators. "Catherine, what are you doing here?" Deputy Chief Foster answered before I could. "We're discussing Nurse Mitchell's role in saving Governor Kellerman's life, both last night and 3 weeks ago when she first identified the governor's cardiac risk factors." Miranda blinked. 3 weeks ago? Dr. Whitmore explained about the previous visit, about my advocacy for additional testing, about how my clinical judgment had potentially prevented a much worse outcome. As he spoke, I watched Miranda's face change. First confusion, then understanding, then something that looked like genuine shock. "You mean," she said slowly, "Catherine identified the governor's cardiac issues before last night?" "That's correct," Dr. Chen said, "and her documentation from that visit was crucial in understanding the progression of the governor's condition." Miranda sank into an empty chair. I had no idea. "There's more," Director Walsh said, and proceeded to explain the job offer, the state position, the recognition of my clinical expertise. When he finished, Miranda was staring at me with an expression I'd never seen before. Not condescension, not dismissal, but something that looked almost like awe. "Catherine," she said quietly, "I owe you an apology." The room was completely silent. Even the state officials seemed to sense that something significant was happening. "I've spent years telling you that you weren't a real nurse, that you were playing dress-up, that you'd never be more than someone who follows orders." Her voice was barely above a whisper. "But you've been practicing advanced medicine while I've been learning to follow protocols." She looked around the room, taking in the faces of the people who had just offered me a position that would make me appear to the physicians she'd spent her career trying to impress. "Last night," she continued, "while I was suggesting unnecessary procedures to try to insert myself into a high-profile case, you were actually saving the governor's life. And 3 weeks ago, while I was probably complaining about my fellowship schedule, you were identifying cardiac risk factors that a physician had missed." Dr. Whitmore cleared his throat gently. "Dr. Mitchell, this morning's meeting was to discuss your clinical judgment during last night's emergency. I'm afraid your suggestion of immediate surgical intervention showed a concerning lack of understanding of appropriate emergency protocols." Miranda nodded, tears starting to form in her eyes. "I know. I was trying so hard to be involved in something important that I almost compromised patient care." She turned back to me. "Catherine, I've been telling you for years that you were trying to be something you're not. But the truth is, I've been trying to be something I'm not. I've been trying to be the kind of doctor who makes life and death decisions. But when it actually mattered, when the governor's life was on the line, I froze. You didn't." The room was so quiet I could hear the clock on the wall ticking. "You've been a real nurse all along," Miranda said, her voice breaking. "You've been the kind of medical professional I've been pretending to be, and I've been too proud and too scared to admit it." Deputy Chief Foster looked between us, clearly realizing she was witnessing something personal and profound. "Dr. Mitchell," she said gently, "perhaps this is a conversation you and your sister should have privately." Miranda shook her head. "No, it needs to be said here, in front of everyone. Catherine deserves to hear this from me in front of the people who are recognizing her for what she's always been." She stood up and walked around the table to where I was sitting. "Catherine, you are everything I pretended to be. You're clinically excellent, you advocate for your patients, You make difficult decisions under pressure, and you save lives. I've spent my entire career chasing prestige and recognition, while you've been earning respect through competence." She paused, wiping her eyes. "And I've been so threatened by your success that I tried to convince you that you were settling for less, when the truth is you were achieving more than I ever have." I looked at my sister, seeing her clearly for perhaps the first time in years. Not the confident surgeon, not the golden child, not the sister who had everything I wanted, just Miranda, finally being honest about who she was and who I was. "I accept your apology," I said quietly. Dr. Whitmore stood up. "I think this is an appropriate place to conclude this morning's meetings. Catherine, you have our contact information. Please consider our offer seriously." As the state officials filed out, followed by the hospital administrators, Miranda and I were left alone in the conference room. "So," she said, attempting a weak smile, "the state of Maryland wants to put you in charge of emergency cardiac protocols. Apparently, and Dr. Whitmore thinks you should consider a rotation through cardiac care." He mentioned it. Miranda laughed, but it wasn't her usual patronizing laugh. It was genuine, almost rueful. "You know what the funny thing is?" she said. "I spent all these years trying to prove I was better than you, and it turns out you were better than me all along. You just didn't need anyone's permission to be excellent." She gathered her things and headed for the door, then turned back. "Catherine, take the job. You'll be amazing at it." And for the first time in our adult lives, I believed that Miranda meant exactly what she said. The story broke on every major news network within 6 hours. Governor Kellerman saved by quick-thinking trauma nurse at Baltimore General Hospital. Nurse's clinical intuition prevents potential tragedy. The nurse who saw what others missed, Catherine Mitchell's life-saving intervention. I was at home, trying to catch up on sleep after my extended shift, when my phone started buzzing incessantly. First it was text messages from colleagues, then calls from reporters, then notifications from social media platforms I barely used. The story had gone viral in a way that medical stories rarely do, capturing something the public found compelling about an unsung healthcare hero stepping up in a crisis. The hospital's public relations department called around noon, asking if I'd be willing to participate in a press conference. Governor Kellerman herself had requested it, wanting to personally thank the medical team that had saved her life and to highlight the critical role that nurses play in emergency care. "The governor specifically asked for you to be featured prominently," the PR director explained. "She wants to talk about how your clinical judgment 3 weeks ago may have prevented a much worse outcome last night." I agreed, though the attention made me uncomfortable. I hadn't become a nurse for recognition or media coverage. But if Governor Kellerman wanted to use her platform to highlight the importance of listening to nurses' clinical assessments, I could support that message. The press conference was scheduled for that evening in the hospital's main auditorium. As I prepared for what would be my first time speaking to the media, I couldn't help but think about how different this was from anything I'd ever imagined for my career. But the real consequences were playing out behind the scenes, in ways I was only beginning to understand. Dr. Whitmore called me personally that afternoon. "Catherine, I wanted to give you a heads up about something. The story about last night has reached some very influential people in the medical community. I've had calls from department heads at Johns Hopkins, George Washington University, even some facilities in Boston and New York. Calls about what? About you. Everyone wants to know about the nurse who identified cardiac risk factors that a physician missed, who assisted with a life-saving procedure on the governor of Maryland, and who's now being offered a state-level position in emergency cardiac care." The weight of his words hit me. This wasn't just local news anymore. My name was circulating in medical circles far beyond Baltimore. "Dr. Whitmore, I hope this doesn't cause problems for the hospital or—" "Catherine," he interrupted. "This is the best kind of problem to have. You've demonstrated that nursing expertise can and should be recognized at the highest levels of healthcare. That's a message this industry desperately needs to hear." He paused for a moment. "I also wanted you to know that Dr. Miranda Mitchell has requested a meeting with me this afternoon. I suspect she wants to discuss her future in the cardiac surgery program." My stomach dropped. "Is she in trouble because of last night?" "That's not for me to discuss over the phone," Dr. Whitmore said diplomatically. "But I will say that last night's events have prompted some serious reflection about clinical judgment and decision-making under pressure." After hanging up, I found myself worrying about Miranda despite everything that had happened between us. Yes, she'd been wrong to suggest unnecessary surgery on the governor. Yes, she'd shown poor clinical judgment under pressure. But she was still my sister, and the thought of her career being derailed because of one night made me feel sick. The press conference that evening was surreal. Governor Kellerman, looking remarkably well for someone who'd been in cardiac arrest less than 24 hours earlier, stood at the podium in the hospital auditorium and delivered a speech that would be quoted in nursing journals for years to come. "Yesterday evening, I suffered a cardiac emergency that could have been fatal," she began, her voice strong and clear. "I'm alive today because of the exceptional medical care I received at Baltimore General Hospital, but I want to be very specific about something. The person who may have saved my life was not a surgeon or a cardiologist or an emergency physician, though all of those professionals provided excellent care." She paused, looking directly at me in the front row. "The person who saved my life was Catherine Mitchell, a trauma nurse who recognized warning signs that others had missed, who advocated for testing that others thought was unnecessary, and who demonstrated clinical judgment that proved to be life-saving." The auditorium was packed with reporters, hospital staff, and what appeared to be officials from various medical organizations. Camera flashes went off constantly as the governor continued her remarks. "3 weeks ago, when I visited this hospital under an assumed name, Nurse Mitchell insisted on additional cardiac testing despite pressure to discharge me with a diagnosis of anxiety. Her clinical intuition and her willingness to advocate for her patient provided crucial information that helped the medical team respond appropriately to my emergency last night." She gestured for me to join her at the podium. Walking up there, in front of all those cameras and reporters, felt like stepping into someone else's life. "Nurse Mitchell," Governor Kellerman said, placing her hand on my shoulder, "represents the best of what nursing can be. She combines clinical expertise with patient advocacy in a way that literally saves lives. The state of Maryland is fortunate to have healthcare professionals of her caliber." When it was my turn to speak, I kept my remarks brief. I talked about the importance of listening to patients, about trusting clinical intuition, and about the critical role that nurses play in emergency care. But mostly I tried to deflect attention from myself and back to the broader healthcare team. "What happened last night wasn't about any one person," I said. "It was about a team of professionals working together to save a life. I'm grateful that my contribution was recognized, but I want people to understand that excellent nursing care happens every day in hospitals across this country. We just don't usually have cameras here to document it." The questions from reporters afterward were intense. They wanted to know about my background, my training, and my future plans. Several asked specifically about the state position I'd been offered, though I deflected those questions since I hadn't made a decision yet. But the question that caught me off guard came from a reporter from the Baltimore Sun. "Nurse Mitchell, we understand that your sister is Dr. Miranda Mitchell, a cardiac surgery fellow who was also involved in the governor's care last night. Can you comment on what it was like to work alongside your sister during such a critical case?" I felt the blood drain from my face. They knew about Miranda, which meant they'd probably looked into her role in last night's events. If they'd done any real investigative work, they might know about her suggestion of unnecessary surgery, about Dr. Whitmore's concerns regarding her clinical judgment. "My sister is an excellent physician," I said carefully. "Emergency medicine requires different skills than surgical practice, and last night's case played to my particular strengths in trauma care." It was a diplomatic answer, but I could see some of the reporters taking notes with expressions that suggested they smelled a bigger story. After the press conference, as I was leaving the hospital, I ran into Dr. Martinez in the parking garage. He'd been part of the team that worked on Governor Kellerman, though he hadn't been included in the media events. "Catherine," he said, looking slightly uncomfortable, "I wanted to thank you again for last night, and for that case 3 months ago when you helped me with the intubation." "Of course, Dr. Martinez, we're a team." He hesitated, then lowered his voice. "I also wanted you to know that there's been talk in the residency program about last night, about the different approaches taken by the trauma team versus the cardiac surgery fellow." My heart sank. "What kind of talk?" "Nothing official, but the residents are discussing it. The way your sister suggested surgery when the situation didn't call for it, the way she seemed to be positioning herself for a high-profile case rather than focusing on appropriate care." He trailed off, clearly uncomfortable with gossiping about a colleague. "Dr. Martinez, I hope people understand that emergency situations are stressful for everyone. We all respond differently under pressure." "I know," he said. "But Catherine, you should also know that what you did last night, the way you anticipated Dr. Chen's needs, the way you prepared for the pericardiocentesis, The way you stayed calm while everyone else was panicking. That's the kind of nursing that makes doctors better. You make all of us better. Driving home, I couldn't shake the feeling that while the media attention was focusing on my achievements, there were consequences playing out for Miranda that I was only beginning to understand. That feeling was confirmed when she called me around 10 that night. "Catherine," her voice was barely above a whisper, "can we talk?" "Of course. Are you okay? Can I come over? I know it's late, but, Miranda, what's wrong? Just, can I come over, please?" She arrived 20 minutes later, looking worse than I'd ever seen her. Still in scrubs, hair unwashed, eyes red from crying, she collapsed onto my couch like someone who hadn't slept in days. "I met with Dr. Whitmore this afternoon," she said without preamble. "And he's recommending that I not continue with the cardiac surgery fellowship." The words hit me like a physical blow. "What? Miranda, why?" "Because my clinical judgment is inconsistent with the standards expected of a cardiac surgeon," she said, using air quotes. "Because I suggested unnecessary intervention on a high-profile patient. Because when it mattered most, I made decisions based on what would advance my career, rather than what was best for the patient." She was crying now, ugly sobs that shook her whole body. "He's not wrong," she continued through her tears. "Last night, when I suggested surgery for Governor Kellerman, it wasn't because I thought she needed it. It was because I wanted to be the one who operated on the governor of Maryland. I wanted it on my CV, in my fellowship evaluation, in the story I could tell at medical conferences." I moved to sit beside her on the couch. "Miranda, while you were actually saving her life, I was thinking about how to use her emergency to advance my career." She looked up at me with red, swollen eyes. "What kind of doctor does that make me?" "It makes you human," I said quietly. "Everyone has moments when their motivations aren't pure." "But not everyone suggests unnecessary surgery on the governor of Maryland in front of the state's leading cardiac surgeon," she replied bitterly. We sat in silence for a few minutes while Miranda tried to compose herself. "The worst part," she finally said, "is that everyone's comparing us now. The nursing staff, the residents, even some of the attendings. They're talking about how the trauma nurse showed better clinical judgment than the cardiac surgery fellow. How Catherine Mitchell knew what to do while Miranda Mitchell was showboating." "People will forget," I said, though I wasn't sure I believed it. "No, they won't, and they shouldn't." She wiped her eyes with the sleeve of her scrub top. "Catherine, I've spent the last 24 hours thinking about our conversation at the barbecue, about me telling you that you'd never be a real nurse. Miranda, we don't need to." "Yes, we do," she interrupted, "because I was projecting. I was so insecure about whether I was a real doctor that I convinced myself the problem was that you were trying to be something you weren't. But the truth is, I was the one trying to be something I wasn't." She turned to face me fully. "You've always been exactly what you were supposed to be, a nurse who saves lives, who advocates for patients, who makes clinical decisions that matter. I've been chasing titles and prestige and recognition, but you've been practicing real medicine. What are you going to do now?" I asked. "Dr. Whitmore suggested I consider a different specialty, maybe internal medicine or family practice, something that plays more to my strengths." She laughed bitterly. "Apparently my strengths don't include making life and death decisions under pressure." "That's not true. You're an excellent physician, Miranda. You just need to find the right fit." "Maybe," she said, "but watching you last night, seeing how you handled everything, how you've always handled everything, I realized that I've been competing in the wrong race. I've been trying to be the most prestigious doctor when I should have been trying to be the best doctor I could be." She stood up to leave, then turned back. "Catherine, take that state job. You'll be incredible at it. And maybe watching you succeed will help me figure out how to do the same thing." After she left, I sat on my couch thinking about how quickly everything had changed. 24 hours ago, I was a trauma nurse whose sister thought she was playing dress-up in scrubs. Now I was being offered state-level positions and my sister's career was in jeopardy. Success, I was learning, was more complicated than I'd ever imagined. And sometimes, achieving everything you'd ever wanted meant watching someone you loved lose everything they thought they needed. 6 weeks after Governor Kellerman's cardiac emergency, I stood in the state capitol building in Annapolis, taking the oath of office as Maryland's first director of emergency cardiac care protocols. The ceremony was small, just a handful of state health officials, hospital administrators, and one very proud family sitting in the front row. Well, most of my family. Dad was there in his best suit, the one he'd worn to my nursing school graduation. Mom sat beside him, dabbing at her eyes with tissues and beaming like I'd just been sworn in as president. Even Grandma Rose had made the trip, wheeled in by Aunt Linda, and already loudly telling anyone who would listen about her granddaughter, the hero nurse who saved the governor. Miranda wasn't there. She'd sent a text that morning. Wish I could be there, but starting my new rotation today. So proud of you, Catherine. You deserve all of this and more. 3 weeks earlier, Miranda had made the difficult decision to withdraw from the cardiac surgery program and transfer to a family medicine residency at Union Memorial Hospital. It was a significant step down in terms of prestige, but as she'd told me during one of our increasingly frequent phone conversations, it was the first time in years that she felt like she was moving toward something rather than running away from something. I'm learning to actually listen to patients again, she'd said during our last conversation. In family medicine, you have time to hear their stories, to understand their lives, to practice medicine that's about more than just technical procedures. The irony wasn't lost on either of us. Miranda was finally learning to do what I'd been doing all along, seeing patients as whole human beings rather than just medical problems to solve. The ceremony concluded with Governor Kellerman herself administering my oath. She'd recovered completely from her cardiac event and had become an unexpected advocate for advancing nursing roles in healthcare. Standing next to her as I promised to faithfully execute the duties of this office, I couldn't help but reflect on how dramatically my life had changed. Dr. Mitchell, she said afterward, using the title that still felt strange to my ears. The position came with an honorary doctorate and administrative credentials that placed me on equal footing with the physicians I'd be working with across the state. Thank you, Governor. I'm honored by your confidence in me. Catherine, she said, dropping the formal tone, I want you to know that what you did for me, both 3 weeks before my emergency and on the night itself, has changed how I think about healthcare policy in this state. We're going to make sure that nurses with your level of expertise have the authority and recognition they deserve. She gestured toward the assembled officials. You'll be working with some of the most influential healthcare leaders in Maryland. Don't let anyone diminish your voice or your expertise. You've earned your place at every table you'll sit at. After the ceremony, my family gathered for dinner at a restaurant in downtown Annapolis. It was the first time in months that we'd all been together, and the absence of Miranda's criticism and competition created a space for something I hadn't experienced in years: unqualified family celebration. I still can't believe it, Mom said for the 10th time, studying the official appointment letter like it might disappear if she looked away. My daughter, working directly with the state government to improve cardiac care across Maryland. Dad raised his beer, to Catherine, who never let anyone tell her she wasn't good enough. Even when that someone was her own sister, Aunt Linda added quietly. The comment hung in the air for a moment. My family had witnessed years of Miranda's subtle put-downs and professional dismissiveness, but they'd never directly addressed it before. Miranda's figuring things out, I said diplomatically. Sometimes it takes a crisis to help us understand what we really want. What she really wanted, Grandma Rose said with the bluntness that comes with being 87 years old, was to make you feel small so she could feel big. But you never were small, Catherine. You just needed the right people to see how big you actually were. That evening, back at my apartment, I called Miranda. She answered on the first ring, sounding tired but more at peace than I'd heard her in months. How was the ceremony? She asked. Good. Different. Still feels surreal. I saw the photos on the governor's social media. You looked perfect up there, Catherine. Like you belonged. There was something in her voice that I'd never heard before. Genuine pride without any underlying resentment or competition. I wish you could have been there, I said. I know, but honestly I think it was better this way. Today was about you and your achievement. I didn't want to complicate that with my own baggage. Miranda, you're my sister. You don't have baggage with me anymore. She was quiet for a long moment. I've been in therapy, Catherine, since the fellowship thing fell apart, trying to understand why I spent so many years tearing you down instead of building you up. This was new. Miranda had never been one for introspection or admitting vulnerability. What are you learning? That I was terrified of not being special. Our whole lives, being the smart one, the successful one, the one with the bright future. That was my identity. When you started excelling in nursing, when you started getting recognition for your clinical skills, it threatened the only version of myself I knew how to be. She paused, and I could hear her taking a shaky breath. So instead of celebrating your success, I convinced myself that what you were doing wasn't as valuable as what I was doing. I diminished your achievements so I wouldn't have to confront the possibility that maybe I wasn't as special as I thought I was. You are special, Miranda. You're an excellent physician. Maybe, but not in the way I thought I was, and definitely not in the way that made me think I was better than you. Her voice got stronger. Catherine, what you've accomplished, the position you've earned, the respect you've gained, you did all of that while I was actively trying to undermine your confidence. That makes your success even more remarkable. I don't think of it that way. Well, I do, and I'm going to spend the rest of my career trying to be the kind of doctor you've always been as a nurse, someone who puts patients first, who advocates for what's right, who makes decisions based on clinical judgment rather than ego. After we hung up, I sat in my kitchen with a cup of tea, thinking about the journey that had brought me to this point. 2 months ago, I was a trauma nurse whose own family questioned the value of her career. Tonight, I was the state's director of emergency cardiac care protocols, with a mandate to improve cardiac outcomes across Maryland. But more importantly, I was finally free from the weight of trying to prove myself to people who had never bothered to understand what I was actually accomplishing. The next morning, I reported to my new office in the State Health Building. It was a far cry from the controlled chaos of the trauma unit: quiet hallways, conference rooms with whiteboards covered in policy frameworks, meetings with administrators who spoke in acronyms and budget allocations. My first official task was to chair a committee developing standardized protocols for emergency cardiac care across all Maryland hospitals. The committee included cardiologists from Johns Hopkins, emergency physicians from University of Maryland, and nursing administrators from hospitals across the state. Walking into that first meeting, I felt a familiar flutter of nervousness. These were some of the most respected medical professionals in the region, and I was going to be leading their discussions, guiding their decisions, shaping policies that would affect thousands of patients. Dr. Patricia Wong from Johns Hopkins was the first to speak after introductions. Dr. Mitchell, we're all familiar with your clinical background and the circumstances that led to this position. I think I speak for everyone when I say we're looking forward to working with someone who has real-world emergency experience. Dr. James Fletcher from University of Maryland nodded. The governor's case highlighted something we've all suspected but haven't always been willing to admit, that some of our best clinical insights come from the nurses who are actually hands-on with patients during emergencies. That's exactly right, said Susan Palmer, the nursing administrator from Anne Arundel Medical Center. We have nurses across the state who consistently demonstrate the kind of clinical judgment that Catherine showed with Governor Kellerman. This committee gives us a chance to systematize that expertise. As the meeting progressed, I found myself settling into a role I'd never expected but somehow felt prepared for. I wasn't just contributing to the discussion, I was guiding it, asking the questions that helped focus the conversation, identifying the practical challenges that would need to be addressed in any new protocols. One thing we need to consider, I said during a discussion about early cardiac intervention, is the reluctance some physicians have to order additional testing when nurses express concerns. We've all seen cases where nursing intuition identified problems that weren't immediately obvious to the medical team. Dr. Wong leaned forward. Are you suggesting we formalize a process for nursing clinical concerns to trigger additional evaluation? I'm suggesting we acknowledge that nurses often catch things others miss, and we build that reality into our protocols rather than pretending it doesn't happen. Dr. Fletcher was making notes. What would that look like practically? Simple checklists, escalation procedures, documentation requirements that make it harder to dismiss nursing concerns without appropriate clinical justification. I pulled up a presentation I'd prepared. I've drafted some preliminary guidelines based on cases from Baltimore General and feedback from nursing staff across the region. For the next hour, we worked through scenarios where nursing advocacy had either prevented bad outcomes or, in some cases, been ignored with negative consequences. It was exactly the kind of systematic, evidence-based approach to healthcare improvement that I'd dreamed about but never thought I'd have the opportunity to lead. At the end of the meeting, Dr. Wong approached me as we were packing up our materials. Catherine, I have to say, this was not what I expected from our first committee meeting. My heart sank. Had I overstepped? Been too aggressive in pushing nursing perspectives? What do you mean? She smiled. I mean, I expected to spend today educating a well-meaning nurse about how hospital administration works. Instead, I found myself learning from someone who clearly understands both the clinical realities and the policy implications better than most of the physicians I work with. Thank you. That means a lot coming from you. I'm curious about something, she said. Your sister is Dr. Miranda Mitchell, isn't she? I remember her from some cardiac surgery conferences before she transferred to family medicine. Yes, that's right. Must be interesting, having two such accomplished medical professionals in one family. I thought about how to answer that. 6 months ago, I would have deflected, minimized my own role, found a way to elevate Miranda's achievements over my own. It is interesting, I said finally. We've both found our way to where we belong, though it took us a while to figure out that we were never really in competition with each other. Dr. Wong nodded thoughtfully. The best medical professionals usually are the ones who understand that healthcare is collaborative, not competitive. Driving home that evening, I realized that something fundamental had shifted in how I thought about myself and my career. For years, I'd been operating from a defensive position, constantly trying to prove that what I did mattered, that nursing was real medicine, that my contributions were valuable. But sitting in that committee meeting, leading discussions with some of the most respected physicians in the state, I wasn't defending anything. I was simply being the medical professional I'd become through years of experience, training, and dedication. I was finally free from the need to prove myself to anyone, including my sister, including my family, and most importantly, including myself. That night, Miranda called again. It was becoming a routine. These evening conversations where we slowly rebuilt a relationship that had been damaged by years of competition and misunderstanding. How was your first day running Marilyn's cardiac care? She asked. Good, really good, actually. I think I'm going to love this job. I never doubted it, she said. Catherine, can I tell you something? Of course. Watching you succeed, seeing you get the recognition you deserve, it's helped me understand something about my own career that I never realized before. What's that? I spent so many years trying to be impressive that I forgot to focus on being good. You've always been good at what you do, and the impressive part followed naturally. I was doing it backwards. And now I'm learning to be a good family medicine doctor. My patients are teaching me things about medicine that I never learned in all my years chasing surgical prestige. It's humbling, but in the best possible way. We talked for another hour about her new rotation, about my policy work, about the family dynamics that had shaped both of our careers. For the first time in our adult lives, we were talking as equals, two medical professionals who had found their respective paths and were supporting each other's success. Catherine, Miranda said, as we were ending the call. I know I said this before, but I need to say it again. I'm sorry for all those years of trying to make you feel like you weren't enough. You were always enough. You were always exactly what you were supposed to be. I know, I said. And Miranda, you're going to be an amazing family medicine doctor, because now you're doing it for the right reasons. After hanging up, I sat in my apartment looking at the official appointment certificate framed on my wall. 6 months ago, I would never have imagined this trajectory for my career. But more importantly, I would never have imagined the peace that came with finally understanding my own worth. Tomorrow, I would start developing policies that could save lives across Maryland. But tonight, I was simply Catherine Mitchell, finally free to be exactly who I'd always been. 1 year later, I stood at the podium of the International Conference on Emergency Medicine in Chicago, looking out at an audience of 3,000 healthcare professionals from around the world. The presentation I was about to give, Integrating Nursing Clinical Judgment into Emergency Cardiac Protocols, the Maryland Model, would be delivered to physicians, nurses, administrators, and policymakers who had come to learn about the program we'd developed over the past 12 months. But as I adjusted the microphone and pulled up my first slide, I wasn't thinking about the statistics I was about to share or the protocols we'd implemented. I was thinking about the barbecue 18 months ago when Miranda had told me I'd never be a real nurse, that I was just playing dress-up in scrubs. The irony was almost overwhelming. Here I was, invited as a keynote speaker to one of the most prestigious medical conferences in the world, specifically because of my expertise as a nurse. Good morning, I began, my voice carrying clearly through the massive auditorium. 18 months ago, if you had told me that I would be standing here today, presenting to this distinguished audience about advancing nursing roles in emergency medicine, I would have thought you were confusing me with someone else. A ripple of polite laughter went through the crowd, not because I didn't believe in the value of nursing expertise, but because I hadn't yet learned the difference between being good at what you do and believing you deserve recognition for being good at what you do. I clicked to my first slide, a photo of Governor Kellerman and me taken at the state capitol during my swearing-in ceremony. This is Governor Patricia Kellerman of Maryland, and this photo was taken when she appointed me as the state's first director of emergency cardiac care protocols. Governor Kellerman is alive today because of a series of clinical decisions that highlight exactly why nursing judgment needs to be integrated into our emergency care systems. Over the next 40 minutes, I walked the audience through the case that had changed everything. Not just the dramatic night when we'd saved the governor's life, but the less dramatic encounter 3 weeks earlier when I'd advocated for testing that a physician wanted to skip. I explained how we'd used that case as a foundation for developing statewide protocols that empowered nurses to formally escalate clinical concerns and required documentation when those concerns were dismissed. The results speak for themselves, I said, clicking to a slide showing our 1-year outcomes. Maryland hospitals participating in our integrated nursing judgment protocols have seen a 17% reduction in cardiac-related mortality, a 23% decrease in missed cardiac events, and a 31% improvement in early intervention rates. The auditorium was completely silent, the kind of attention that speakers dream of. But the most important outcome isn't captured in these statistics, I continued. It's the culture change that happens when institutions formally recognize that expertise comes from experience and competence, not just degrees and titles. After my presentation, the response was overwhelming. Physicians approached me wanting to implement similar programs in their hospitals. Nursing administrators asked for detailed implementation guides. International delegates requested consultation on adapting our protocols for their healthcare systems. But the conversation that meant the most came from Dr. Sarah Chen, my former supervisor from Baltimore General, who had flown to Chicago specifically to attend my presentation. "Catherine," she said, finding me in the corridor outside the auditorium, "do you realize what you just accomplished in there? I gave a presentation about our protocol development. You just influenced emergency medicine policy for thousands of hospitals around the world," she said, shaking her head in amazement. 3,000 of the most influential healthcare professionals on the planet just spent 40 minutes hanging on every word from a nurse who 18 months ago was questioning whether she belonged in medicine at all. Dr. Chen was right, but it was more than that. What I'd really accomplished was finally understanding that I'd always belonged. The recognition, the platform, the influence, those were just external validation of something that had been true all along. That evening, the conference organizers hosted a reception for keynote speakers. I found myself in conversations with department heads from Harvard Medical School, policy advisors from the World Health Organization, and researchers from institutions I'd only read about in medical journals. "Dr. Mitchell," said Dr. Mitchell, Elizabeth Torres, who ran the emergency medicine program at Stanford. "I wanted to discuss the possibility of you consulting on a similar initiative we're considering in California." "I'd be interested in that conversation," I replied. "Excellent. We're particularly impressed with your approach to documentation requirements when nursing concerns are dismissed. That's a politically sensitive issue that most administrators avoid addressing directly." Michael Chang from Singapore General Hospital joined our conversation. "We're dealing with similar challenges in Southeast Asia. The hierarchical nature of many medical systems makes it difficult for nurses to voice clinical concerns. Your model provides a framework for culture change that we desperately need." As the evening progressed, I realized I was no longer the trauma nurse who had to fight for her voice to be heard. I was a healthcare leader whose voice was being actively sought by institutions around the world. The transformation was complete, but it hadn't happened when Governor Kellerman's cardiac event thrust me into the spotlight. It hadn't happened when the state offered me the director position. It had happened gradually, through years of making good clinical decisions, advocating for patients, and refusing to let other people's limitations define my potential. The external recognition was wonderful, but the internal transformation was what truly mattered. 3 days after returning from Chicago, I had lunch with Miranda at a small cafe near Union Memorial Hospital, where she was completing her family medicine residency. She looked healthier than I'd seen her in years, less stressed, more at peace with herself and her choices. "I watched your keynote presentation online," she said over salads. "The whole thing, Catherine, it was incredible." "Thank you. How are things going with your residency?" "Really well, actually. I had a patient yesterday, an elderly man with diabetes who was struggling to manage his medications. Instead of just adjusting his prescriptions and sending him home, I spent an hour with him talking about his daily routine, his family support system, his understanding of his condition." Miranda paused, smiling in a way I hadn't seen since we were children. By the end of that conversation, I understood that his medication compliance issues weren't about the prescriptions at all. They were about depression, social isolation, and fear about his prognosis. So we addressed those things too, not just the blood sugar numbers. That sounds like excellent medicine, I said. It's the kind of medicine you've always practiced, she replied. Seeing patients as whole people, not just medical problems. It took me losing everything I thought I wanted to learn how to do what you've always done naturally. Miranda, you didn't lose everything, you found your path. You're right, she said. And Catherine, I need to tell you something else. Watching you succeed, seeing you get the recognition you deserve, it's helped me understand what success actually looks like. What do you mean? For years I measured success by external markers, prestigious programs, impressive titles, recognition from people I thought mattered. But watching you build something meaningful, watching you influence policy that will save lives across the country, that's real success. She reached across the table and took my hand. You never needed anyone's permission to be excellent, Catherine. You just needed to stop waiting for it. 2 weeks later, I received a call that would have seemed impossible 18 months earlier. Dr. Amanda Richardson, the Dean of Nursing at Johns Hopkins University, was offering me a position as a professor and the founding director of a new Center for Advanced Nursing Practice in Emergency Medicine. Dr. Mitchell, she said, we want to create a program that trains nurses to function at the level you've demonstrated, clinical leaders who can make autonomous decisions, influence policy, and advance the profession. We can't think of anyone better qualified to lead that initiative. The offer was tempting, the prestige, the platform, the opportunity to shape nursing education at one of the world's most respected institutions, but as I considered it, I realized that my answer revealed how completely my perspective on success had evolved. Dr. Richardson, I'm honored by the offer, but I need to decline. The work I'm doing with the state is just getting started, and I think I can have more immediate impact on patient care by continuing to develop and refine these protocols. I understand, she said, but Catherine, the offer will remain open. When you're ready to take on the challenge of reshaping nursing education, we'll be here. After hanging up, I realized that declining a prestigious position at Johns Hopkins felt completely natural, not because I didn't value the opportunity, but because I'd learned to measure success by impact rather than prestige. 6 months later, our Maryland protocols had been adopted by hospitals in 12 states. I was invited to testify before a Senate subcommittee on healthcare policy about the role of nursing expertise in emergency medicine. The testimony led to federal funding for similar programs nationwide, but the moment that truly captured my transformation came during a site visit to a small hospital in rural Maryland that had recently implemented our protocols. Dr. Mitchell, said Jennifer Walsh, the charge nurse in their emergency department, I wanted to thank you personally for this program. Tell me how it's working for you. Last month, we had a case that would have been a disaster under our old system. A middle-aged woman came in with chest pain that the ER physician initially attributed to anxiety. But our new protocols required him to document his clinical reasoning when I expressed concerns about her presentation. Jennifer's eyes lit up as she continued the story. That documentation requirement made him pause and really consider my assessment. He ordered the additional testing I was recommending, and it turned out she was having a heart attack. We caught it early enough to prevent any permanent damage. That's exactly what the protocols are designed to do. But Dr. Mitchell, the most important thing isn't that we saved this woman's life. It's that afterward, the physician thanked me for pushing him to look deeper. He said it made him a better doctor. That's culture change. Driving back to Baltimore that evening, I thought about the ripple effects of standing up for yourself, of refusing to accept other people's limitations as your own reality. Jennifer Walsh was now empowered to advocate for her patients in ways that had been impossible before. Her physician colleagues were learning to value nursing judgment as part of comprehensive care. Patients across Maryland were receiving better care because I'd finally learned to believe in my own expertise. That night, I called my parents to tell them about the site visit, about the expanding adoption of our protocols, about the invitation to testify before Congress. I'm so proud of you, Catherine, Mom said, her voice thick with emotion, but I need to tell you something. I was always proud of you, even before all this recognition. You've always been exactly the person we hoped you'd become. Even when Miranda was telling everyone I wasn't a real nurse. Especially then, Dad said, joining the conversation on speakerphone, because that's when we saw who you really were. Someone who kept doing excellent work even when it wasn't being acknowledged. someone who never let other people's insecurities make her doubt her own worth. A year and a half after Governor Kellerman's cardiac emergency, Miranda and I were having dinner at our parents' house when Mom brought out a box of old photos she'd been organizing. "Look what I found," she said, pulling out a picture of Miranda and me as children, both wearing toy stethoscopes and playing doctor with our dolls. "Even then, you were both determined to be in medicine," Mom said fondly. Miranda picked up the photo, studying it carefully. "Look at Catherine's face in this picture," she said. "She's not just playing, she's completely focused on taking care of her patient." She handed me the photo. "You know what's funny? I spent all those years trying to convince you that you weren't meant for medicine, but this picture shows that medicine was always meant for you." "We were both meant for medicine," I said, "just in different ways." "True," Miranda agreed. "But Catherine, you figured out your way a lot faster than I figured out mine. And you stayed true to it even when everyone around you was suggesting you were aiming too low." As we looked through more photos, I realized that my transformation wasn't really about becoming someone different. It was about finally becoming fully myself, the person I'd always been but had been afraid to own completely. The girl in that childhood photo, playing doctor with complete seriousness and genuine care, had grown up to influence healthcare policy across the country, not because she'd changed who she was, but because she'd finally stopped apologizing for being exactly who she was. Today, when people ask me about the night I saved Governor Kellerman's life, I tell them the truth. That night wasn't when I became a real nurse. I'd always been a real nurse. That night was simply when the world finally noticed. The real transformation happened when I stopped waiting for permission to be excellent and started owning the expertise I'd been developing all along. And that's a lesson that extends far beyond medicine. Whatever field you're in, whatever challenges you're facing, whatever voices are telling you that you're not enough, or you're aiming too high, or you should be satisfied with less than you're capable of, remember this: competence doesn't require anyone else's validation. Excellence is its own authority. Expertise speaks for itself. And the moment you stop apologizing for being good at what you do is the moment you become unstoppable. You don't need anyone's permission to be exactly who you're meant to be. You just need the courage to stop waiting for it. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.